There is a moment, and most people who have lived long enough will recognize it when they hear it described, where the life you were supposed to live and the life you actually need to live come so close together that you can feel the friction between them. You can feel it in your chest. You can feel it in the space behind your eyes. Most people, when they reach that moment, look away. They fold the real life back up, tuck it somewhere quiet and unvisited, and they return to the performance that everyone around them has come to expect. They become very good at performing, and they live out their days inside a story that was written for them before they were old enough to hold a pen. Margaret Eleanor Voss reached that moment on a Tuesday morning in October. She was standing at the graveside of her father, the most powerful man she had ever known, and also in certain ways the loneliest, surrounded by 40 people dressed in black, each one composed in that particular way that very wealthy people learn to grieve in public. The coffin was mahogany, the flowers were white roses, her father's preference, not hers. The minister was reading from Psalms in a voice calibrated precisely to the occasion, and Margaret Voss, who had attended every event she was supposed to attend, sat in every seat she had been assigned and smiled at every camera and every dinner table and every board meeting for 38 years. Made a decision. Not with words, not with drama, with her feet. She stepped back from the graveside while the minister was still speaking. She walked to her car. She started the engine, and she drove away from a $4 billion inheritance before they had even closed the casket. Nobody in her family saw her leave. Nobody in her family knew where she went. And nobody, not her mother, not her brothers, not the team of private investigators who came later, heard from her for 8 full years. Stay with me, because what happened next is one of the most extraordinary stories I have ever had the privilege of telling on this channel. And I promise you this, by the time we reach the end, you will never think about money, family, or the courage it takes to build a real life in quite the same way again. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Before we get deeper into what Margaret did and why she did it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because we have stories coming that are going to stop you in your tracks. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand the woman who walked away from everything on the worst day of her life, you first have to understand the world she was walking away from. Richard Harlan Voss was born in 1947 in a 2-bedroom house in a small town outside of Dayton, Ohio. His father worked at a paper mill. His mother cleaned the homes of wealthier families in the area. Families whose names were on buildings and whose children went to different schools than Richard did. And Richard, from the time he was old enough to understand the difference between those two worlds, made himself a promise that was less of a hope and more of a declaration. He would cross that line. He did not know how. He did not know when. But the certainty that he would was a fixed point in his interior life from early boyhood, and it never moved. He put himself through Ohio State on a combination of academic scholarships and weekend construction work. He graduated in 1969 with a degree in civil engineering and immediately took a job with a mid-sized development company in Columbus. He was 22 years old. He slept 5 hours a night. He kept a notebook in his shirt pocket at all times. Him and the people who worked with him in those early years would later say that the notebook was full not just of calculations and sketches, but of something harder to describe. A kind of running argument with the world about what was possible and what wasn't. Richard Voss was constantly, quietly, furiously negotiating with the limits of what people told him he could do. By the time he was 31, he had started his own firm. By 35, he had completed his first major commercial project, a mixed-use development in downtown Columbus that turned an abandoned warehouse district into something that city planners had been trying to achieve for a decade. By 40, the Voss Development Group had offices in 4 cities. By 45, it was operating nationally. By 50, Richard Harlan Voss was worth just over $1 billion. And he was one of those people whose drive does not diminish with success, but intensifies, as if the achievement of each milestone only clarifies how much further there is still to go. He married Catherine Aldridge in 1978. She was the daughter of a Boston architect whose family name opened rooms that Richard's money, at that point, was only beginning to unlock. It was a marriage that most people who observed it from the outside described as strategic. The people who knew them better said something more complicated and more human, that it began as a strategic alignment and became, over time, something genuine and difficult and real in the way that long marriages always are. They had 3 children. William came first in 1980, then Charles in 1982, and then, in 1985, Margaret Eleanor, the last child, the only daughter. The one who would eventually, against every expectation and at enormous personal cost, become the most consequential member of the Voss family that anyone could have imagined. Richard Voss's plan for his children was as precisely engineered as everything else he built. William would lead the development division, Charles would manage the investment portfolio, and Margaret, thoughtful, composed, socially gifted Margaret, would serve as the family's public face. She would chair the Voss Family Foundation. She would represent the human side of the brand at galas and conferences and political dinners. She would be the warmth behind the empire. Richard had designed this role for her with great care. He had, in his own way, thought about it as a gift. He never once asked her whether she wanted it. Here is what Richard Voss never fully understood about his daughter, and what makes this story not just extraordinary, but also deeply, quietly heartbreaking. He had built an entire life on the belief that the right structure, applied with sufficient intelligence and will, could produce any outcome. He believed this about real estate. He believed it about markets, and he believed it about his family. He could not see, or perhaps could not allow himself to see, that the daughter sitting at the edge of every family photograph had an interior life that his structures simply could not contain. Margaret was not unhappy in any simple or dramatic sense. She was not a rebel. She was not resentful in the way that makes people act out or lash back. She was something quieter and more irreversible than any of that. She was clear. She saw her life with a clarity that most of us spend decades trying to achieve and never quite reach. And what she saw, when she looked at the future her father had designed for her, was a performance. A beautiful, comfortable, well-appointed performance, but a performance nonetheless. A life in which her role had been written and her lines had been rehearsed and the audience had been seated, and the only thing left to do was to walk out onto the stage and begin. Margaret Voss had been rehearsing for that performance for 38 years, and somewhere along the way, in the years before October 14th, the years we will get to soon, she had quietly, methodically decided that she was not going to go on. Now, before we tell you what she did instead, let us pause for a moment on the world she was preparing to leave. Because $4 billion is a number that floats above human comprehension. It does not connect to anything in ordinary experience. So let me try to make it real. $4 billion means that if you spent $1,000 every single day starting from the day you were born, it would take you more than 10,000 years to spend it all. It means the Voss family could have funded the entire operating budget of a mid-size American city for several years and still had enough remaining to start over. It means that the Voss name, by the time Richard was in his late 60s, was not simply a brand. It was an institution. It was a legacy in the fullest and most weighted sense of that word. The kind of thing that creates its own gravity, its own rules, its own demands on the people born into it. And standing at the center of all that gravity, in the final months of her father's life, was Margaret. Watching him diminish, watching the empire he had built continue to operate without him, the way a great machine continues to run, even after the engineer has stepped away from the controls. Attending the family meetings, sitting through the consultations with the estate attorneys, listening to the conversations about what would happen next, who would take what role, how the legacy would be protected and extended and preserved. And throughout all of it, every meeting, every dinner, every careful conversation about the future, Margaret was doing something that no one in her family suspected. She was planning her exit with the same methodical precision that her father had used to build his empire. His daughter was engineering her escape from it. She had not chosen a destination, not yet. She had chosen, first, a direction, away from the Voss name, away from the foundation role, away from the expectation that had followed her like a shadow since the day she was old enough to understand what the name meant. She had chosen the direction before she chose the town. She chose the town on the day she buried her father. And that is where we need to go next. In the 18 months before Richard Voss died, the pressure on Margaret intensified in ways that were almost physically felt. It was not shouted or enforced or imposed through any single dramatic confrontation. It was something more effective and more suffocating than that. It was the pressure of accumulated expectation, arriving in small doses, daily, the way water shapes stone. A comment from her brother William at Sunday dinner about the foundation's governance structure and how important it would be to have the right leadership in place. A quiet conversation with the family's estate attorney about timing and transition and the importance of continuity. A look from her mother, not accusing, not demanding, just hopeful in a way that carried its own kind of weight. When the family gathered on weekends at the estate, Richard's health declined faster than anyone had expected. He had been a man of extraordinary physical vitality for most of his life. The kind of man who walked construction sites in his 60s and took stairs instead of elevators, and never once gave the impression that his body might someday become a limitation. And then it did. And the diagnosis came in the spring of the year before he died. By summer, he was using a cane. By fall, he was not coming into the office. By the following spring, he was spending most of his time at the estate, in the room he had always used as a private study, the one with the drafting table he had kept since his early career, the one where the shelves held scale models of his earliest developments alongside photographs of the skylines his company had helped shape. Margaret visited him in that room many times in those final months. She would sit across from him, and he would talk, and she would listen. He talked about the company. He talked about legacy. He talked about the responsibility that came with building something of consequence and the importance of stewardship and what it meant to protect what you had created. When Margaret listened. She was very good at listening. She had been listening her whole life. What she never told him, what she could not tell him, because the telling would have required a conversation that neither of them had the language for, was that she heard something different in his words than what he intended. She heard a man who had built everything he ever set out to build, and who had arrived, at the end of his life, at the quiet recognition that the building had cost him something he could not quite name. She heard a man who loved his children in the truest way he knew how, which was by trying to give them the protection of the thing he had created. And she heard, underneath all of it, beneath the language of legacy and stewardship and responsibility, a man who had never once asked his daughter what she actually wanted. She did not blame him for that. That is one of the things that makes Margaret's story so resistant to simple telling. There is no villain here. Richard Voss was not a bad father. He was a man who had been shaped by forces older and more powerful than he was, by a childhood of scarcity, by the particular American story of the self-made man, by a culture that taught him that the greatest gift you could give your children was the thing you had built for them. He loved Margaret. He loved her in the only way he knew how to love, by making sure she would never have to struggle, never have to wonder, never have to fight for a seat at the table. The tragedy was not that he didn't love her. The tragedy was that his love had the same architecture as his buildings, sturdy, impressive, carefully designed, and not built with any exits. Margaret made her preparations in the evenings. After the family dinners and the attorney consultations and the hospital visits and the careful performances of continuity and calm, she would go home to her apartment in the city, a beautiful apartment in a building that bore indirectly the Voss name, and she would sit at her desk and work, not on foundation proposals or board presentations or any of the things her family expected her to be working on. She worked on the architecture of her exit. She read. She made calculations. She studied a set of financial structures she had been thinking about for years, structures that had their roots in her own deep knowledge of the Voss empire, but that pointed in a completely different direction. She drew maps. She looked at towns. She made lists of things she would need and things she would leave behind. And she wrote in a small notebook she kept locked in the top drawer of her desk the beginnings of a plan that she had never told anyone about. Not her closest friend. Not the therapist she had seen for 3 years. Not anyone. Because the plan required one thing above all others to work. It required that nobody see it coming. The morning of October 14th was gray and cold, and still in the way that early autumn mornings sometimes are in that part of the country. A stillness that feels less like peace and more like something holding its breath. Margaret arrived at the family estate at 7:15. She was dressed in black. She had done her hair carefully. She brought white roses. She hugged her mother in the entryway. Irene and Catherine Voss held on a beat longer than usual, the way mothers do when they are trying to give or receive something that words cannot carry. Margaret patted her back gently and said something about the flowers. The moment passed the way moments do. She moved through the morning of the funeral, the way she had moved through every important Voss family occasion for her entire adult life. Present, composed, appropriate to the occasion in every visible detail. She spoke with the estate manager about the logistics of the reception. She confirmed the seating arrangement for the family car. She accepted coffee from the housekeeper, a woman named Gloria Reyes who had worked for the Voss family for 22 years, and who would later say when asked that Margaret that morning had seemed different. Not distressed. Not grieving in any particularly visible way. Different in a quality that Gloria struggled to name until she finally landed on the word resolved. She seemed, Gloria said, like someone who had made a very difficult decision a long time ago and had simply arrived at the moment when they were going to act on it. The church service lasted 1 hour and 45 minutes. William spoke first, controlled, proud, the language of a firstborn son addressing the legacy of a great man. Charles spoke second, and was the only one of the 3 children who actually cried, which seemed to surprise even him. 2 of Richard's oldest business partners delivered eulogies that used the word Titan a combined 4 times. Margaret did not speak. She had been scheduled to. There was a slot in the printed program. Her name, her title within the foundation, a blank space where her words were supposed to go. 3 days before the funeral, she had quietly told her mother that she didn't think she could get through it. Catherine had understood. She thought her daughter was simply too grief-stricken. She was not too grief-stricken. She was too clear. She knew that if she stood at that podium and spoke the words that the moment required, the words about legacy and love and carrying forward what her father had built, she would be making a promise she could not keep. And Margaret Voss did not make promises she did not intend to keep. That was, in fact, one of the things that made what she was about to do so deliberate, so carefully planned, so entirely the opposite of an impulsive act. She had thought about this moment for years. She had arrived at it with her eyes fully open, and she was not going to stand at her father's funeral and speak a lie, even a beautiful one, even one that would have made her mother's eyes fill with grateful tears. At the graveside, the family stood close together in the unconscious way that grief clusters bodies, pulling people toward each other without a decision being made. All except Margaret, who stood perhaps 4 feet to the right of her mother, close enough to be present, far enough to be alone. The minister was reading from Psalms. The coffin was suspended above the open earth. The white roses had been laid. Everything was proceeding exactly as the occasion demanded, and Margaret was looking at something no one else seemed to be looking at. Not the coffin, not the minister, not her family. She was looking at the open gate at the far end of the cemetery path, one where the row of black cars were parked along the verge, and beyond the gate, the road. She stepped back from the graveside while the minister was still reading. 1 step, then 2. Then she turned and she walked toward the cars, not hurrying, not hesitating. Walking the way you walk when you have made a decision so completely that your body has already accepted it and simply needs your legs to catch up. She passed the family's town car. She passed the vehicle arranged for her brothers. She walked to the gray sedan she had driven herself that morning, which was unusual. Margaret almost never drove herself. The family driver, a man named Leonard, watched her from across the lot and assumed she was getting something from the car. He watched her get in. He watched her start the engine. He watched her pull slowly out of the parking space. He watched her drive past the gate. He did not think anything of it until almost an hour later, when Catherine Voss asked him where Margaret had gone, and he realized, with a feeling he later described as the bottom dropping out of a room, that he had no answer. By the time the minister said amen and the family turned to face what came next, Margaret Eleanor Voss was already on the highway. Her phone was in her apartment, plugged in, turned off. Her credit cards were in her apartment. Her laptop was in her apartment. The keys to the family estate, which she had carried on her key ring for 15 years, were in a small bowl on her kitchen counter. And on the kitchen table, in an envelope addressed to no one, was a single piece of paper with one sentence written on it in Margaret's handwriting. A sentence that her mother would not find for 3 days, and that would change the way Catherine Voss understood her daughter forever. We will get to that sentence. But first we need to follow Margaret north, 6 hours north, to a town called Callow Creek, whose name nobody in the Voss family had ever heard, and whose importance to this story cannot be overstated. Back at the Voss estate, the reception was underway. Beautiful food on long tables. Catered staff moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. 40-some guests, business partners, political figures, family friends. The kinds of people whose presence at a funeral was itself a statement about the significance of the deceased. The conversation was the careful, measured conversation of people who have gathered around loss, but must not be consumed by it. And William moved through the room with the composed authority of a man assuming his position. Charles stood in a corner with two of his father's oldest friends and seemed genuinely moved by them. Catherine received condolences with the grace of long practice and real feeling combined. And then, perhaps 90 minutes in, Charles put down his glass and looked around the room with a slight furrow in his brow and said, to no one in particular, to the air itself, "Has anyone seen Margaret?" The question moved through the room like a change in barometric pressure. People looked toward other people. Assumptions were made and discarded. Catherine tried the phone. 4 rings. Voicemail. She tried again. William tried. The estate attorney tried twice from the study, and slowly, in the way that a serious thing reveals itself through the accumulation of small confusions, the family began to understand that Margaret was not in another room. She was not in the garden. She was not upstairs resting. She was simply gone. 6 hours is a long time to be alone in a car with a decision you have just made irreversible. It is long enough for second thoughts to arrive, take a seat, and stay a while. It is long enough for grief to change shape, to begin as the grief of a daughter who has just buried her father and become something larger and stranger, the grief of a self that has just stepped out of a performance it has been delivering for decades. Margaret drove north through the gray October afternoon with the radio off and the heat on and the quiet of the car around her, like something she had not experienced in a very long time. Like permission, like space that belonged entirely to her, that carried none of the weight of the Voss name, that asked nothing and expected nothing, and simply continued forward at 70 miles an hour through the flattening landscape of the late afternoon. She had not chosen Callow Creek for any dramatic reason. She had not driven through it as a child. She had no connection to it of any kind that she could have articulated to anyone who asked. She had found it the way you find the truest things. By accident, late one night, looking at a map for no particular reason, following a road north with her finger until it ended at a dot too small to have a label in any major atlas, and then finding the name in the index, Callow Creek, population 2,310, approximately 6 hours from the city. She had written it in the small notebook she kept locked in the top drawer of her desk. She had circled it once, and she had, without deciding anything formally, understood that this was where she was going. Not because of anything Callow Creek was, because of what it was not. It was not on any map that anyone in her family would think to look at. It was not the kind of place that wealthy people in distress drove to. It was not in any way a logical destination for Margaret Eleanor Voss. And that was the point. She pulled into Callow Creek at 4:17 in the afternoon. Main Street, one grocery store, 2 churches, a hardware store with a handwritten sign in the window advertising split firewood, a post office that shared its building with a copy shop, a diner called Patsy's with a neon sign in the window that said open and a smaller sign below it that said home cooking since 1962. Margaret parked across from the diner. She sat in the car for 12 minutes. A woman walking a dog glanced at the gray sedan with city plates and looked away. A boy on a bicycle rode past without looking at all. The town moved around her at its own pace with its own rhythms, entirely indifferent to the fact that a woman carrying a $4 billion inheritance and a 38-year-old grief was sitting in its midst, trying to remember how to breathe. Then she got out of the car. She crossed the street. She pushed open the door of Patsy's diner, and a small bell above the door announced her arrival to a room containing 4 customers, 2 booths, and a counter woman in her early 50s with reading glasses on top of her head and the particular quality of stillness that comes from having worked the same counter for 19 years and having seen most of what the world has to offer come through a door. Her name was Donna Hatfield. She poured Margaret a coffee before Margaret had fully sat down. The reflex of someone who has learned that everyone who walks through a diner door in the late afternoon needs coffee. And she asked, without particular curiosity, what she could get her. Margaret said grilled cheese. And then Margaret sat at that counter and ate the best grilled cheese sandwich she had eaten in a very long time. In the particular way that food tastes when you are finally, after a very long period of tension, able to taste it. She did not speak for a while. She drank her coffee. She looked out through the window at Main Street, and Donna, who had a gift for knowing when someone needed conversation and when they needed the particular companionship of simply being left alone in the presence of another human being, left her alone until she didn't. "Passing through," Donna said, refilling the coffee without being asked. Margaret thought about that for a moment. The question was simple. The answer was not. She was passing through, had been passing through, had spent 38 years passing through a life that belonged to someone else's design. She was, she realized, finally stopping. "I'm not sure yet," Margaret said. "Can you tell me who owns the old mill building on the edge of town?" Donna set down the coffee pot and looked at her with an expression that was 3 parts curiosity, 1 part wariness, and 1 part something else. Recognition, perhaps, of the particular quality of a person who has arrived somewhere and already begun to see it not as it is, but as it could be. "Fellow named Hatch," Donna said. "Been sitting empty 11 years. He'd be glad to hear from someone interested." Margaret nodded. She finished her coffee. She left a tip that was twice the cost of the meal, and she went back to her car and found a motel 6 miles up the road and checked in with cash. She had brought enough cash for several months, another piece of the plan she had assembled in those late-night hours at her desk. And she lay on top of the covers in a room with a water stain on the ceiling and a window that looked out on a parking lot, and she thought, for the first time in longer than she could remember, about nothing except what tomorrow might look like. Not what it was supposed to look like, what it might actually be. She slept for 11 hours. The following Tuesday, Margaret Eleanor Voss, who introduced herself in Callow Creek not as Margaret Voss but as Margaret Ellie, her middle name used as a last name, a small and careful anonymity, purchased the old mill building from a man named Gerald Hatch for a figure well below its structural value, paid entirely in cash, and shook hands on the deal in the parking lot of Patsy's diner, while Donna Hatfield watched through the window with the expression of a woman who has just witnessed something she will be telling people about for years. And while Margaret was shaking that hand, back in the city, her mother was standing in the kitchen of Margaret's apartment, where she had let herself in with the spare key that Margaret had always kept with her. Catherine Voss had found the envelope on the kitchen table. She had opened it, and she had read in her daughter's clear and unrushed handwriting 1 sentence that she would carry in her chest for 8 years. 1 sentence that would become, in the fullness of time, the key to understanding everything. The sentence said, "I have loved you all as well as I knew how. And I need to find out what I am capable of without the name." Catherine read it 3 times. Then she sat down at her daughter's kitchen table in her daughter's empty apartment with a coffee cup she did not remember making, and she thought about her daughter. Not about the money, not about the foundation or the estate, or the frozen inheritance process that the attorneys were already beginning to discuss. About Margaret, about the little girl who had always sat slightly apart at family events, about the woman who had always listened more than she spoke, and, in listening, had always seemed to understand something that everyone else in the room was missing. And Catherine Voss, who was a smart woman, a woman who had spent 40 years watching a brilliant and inflexible man build an empire, and who understood, better than most, in what empires cost the people inside them, allowed herself for just a moment, before she called William, to feel something that was less panic than recognition, less grief than, against all expectation, a quiet and complicated pride. When a woman worth $4 billion disappears, the response is not what you might expect if you have never been inside the world of institutional wealth. There is no dramatic police search. There is no missing persons broadcast. There is instead a very controlled and very private process driven primarily by attorneys and the particular anxiety of people whose legal and financial futures are bound to the missing persons decisions. William Voss, from the moment the reality of Margaret's departure became undeniable, was driven less by concern for his sister's well-being than by the concrete and urgent problem that her absence created. The will had named Margaret as co-executor. Without her signature and cooperation, the inheritance process was effectively frozen. His portion, Charles's portion, the foundation's endowment, all of it sitting in legal suspension while somewhere, somehow, Margaret was not there to sign the documents. He hired a private investigator within the week, a firm out of the city with a corporate practice and a track record handling sensitive cases involving high-net-worth individuals. The lead investigator, a former federal agent named Raymond Calloway, was thorough, professional, and, over the following 3 weeks, increasingly frustrated. Margaret had not used a credit card since the morning of the funeral. At airports, not at train stations, not at airports, not at train stations, not at bus terminals. It was, Calloway would later say in a document that eventually became part of the family's legal record, the most methodical civilian disappearance he had ever encountered. It had the characteristics, he noted, of something planned not in the heat of crisis, but in careful advance. She had taken only what she needed. She had left behind everything that could be traced. Raymond Calloway refunded a portion of his retainer at the end of the 3rd week and told William, with professional honesty, that he did not believe his sister was in any danger, that she had left voluntarily and with considerable preparation, and that finding her would require either a significant piece of luck or access to information that he did not currently have. William thanked him and hired a second firm. The second investigator worked for 6 weeks and got farther. He traced a gas station purchase, cash, from a station at the edge of a county that was in the general direction of where Margaret had eventually gone. He spent 2 weeks driving through small towns in that region, asking questions, showing a photograph. He never found Callow Creek. This was partly because Margaret had taken a secondary route that avoided the obvious highways, and partly because Callow Creek was the kind of town that, once it decided to protect someone, did so with a thoroughness that comes from long practice. Small towns learn quickly who belongs and who is asking too many questions. The investigator was, by all accounts, a recognizable figure the moment he arrived anywhere. Suited, city-tired, slightly tense in the way of someone operating outside their comfort zone. No one told him anything useful. He drove back to the city and submitted a final report that contained a great deal of careful language about the difficulty of the case and very little information about where Margaret was. Meanwhile, the estate attorneys were doing what estate attorneys do, which is to say they were finding ways to work around the problem without solving it. They restructured the inheritance process in stages. They filed the appropriate motions. They kept the machine moving as much as it could be moved without Margaret's participation. William received his portion of the estate. Charles received his. The foundation received an interim endowment that would keep it operational. And Margaret's share, her portion of the $4 billion legacy, which had been growing through investment during the years of her absence, was placed in a legal structure that preserved it for her, regardless of how long she stayed away. The attorneys were very clear on this point because William had asked, in a conversation that Charles later described as one of the more uncomfortable he had ever witnessed, whether there was any mechanism by which an absent heir could be declared to have forfeited their claim. The attorneys were very clear. There was not. Charles drove to Callow Creek in the 6th year. He found it before the private investigator did, though he would not tell anyone exactly how, and it would be impolite to speculate. He spent 2 days there. He walked through the Creek Commons, and we will get to the Creek Commons soon, because it is the center of everything. And he had dinner at Patsy's, and he met Donna Hatfield, and he sat across from his sister in a quiet corner of the diner on the second evening, and had what he would later describe as the longest and most honest conversation of his adult life. He flew home and called William. He told his brother that he thought Margaret was right. William was not ready to hear that. The call ended badly, but Charles had said it, and saying it was, for Charles, a kind of arrival of its own. In Callow Creek, Margaret Ellie, as she was known to everyone in town, began her life the way all real lives begin, which is to say clumsily, with more uncertainty than confidence, making mistakes in public and learning from them and trying again. She was not immediately beloved. She was not immediately trusted. Small towns have long memories and a well-developed instinct for people who arrive with resources and intentions and then leave when the intentions run out. There were people in Callow Creek who assumed Margaret would be gone in 6 months. There were people who were politely cool to her for the better part of a year. There was a county commissioner named Dale Pratchett who made it his business to ask pointed questions at every public meeting about who exactly this woman was and where her money was coming from and what she wanted in return for it. Margaret's answer to Dale Pratchett, delivered at a town council meeting in her 3rd month in Callow Creek, was worth the price of admission. She looked at him across the table, calm, direct, without the performative graciousness she had deployed in 1,000 rooms before this one, and she said, "What I want is to live here, to be a neighbor, to find out whether the things I know how to do are useful to people who actually need them. And if they're not, I'll know that too, and I'll adjust." She paused, and then she said, "I'm not going anywhere, Dale. I've had everything, and I came here for something different. I'm planning to find it." Dale Pratchett did not become her greatest advocate, but he never actively opposed her again. And in a small town, that is its own form of endorsement. She rented a room from a woman named Ruth Calloway, 71 years old, widowed, living in a house on the north side of town that was slightly too large for one person and full of the particular accumulation of a long life. Ceramic roosters on every surface, a collection of Reader's Digest condensed books going back to 1967, a kitchen table that had hosted every significant conversation of Ruth Calloway's adult life, and that now began hosting the conversations of someone at the very beginning of figuring out what her adult life was actually going to look like. Ruth charged Margaret $250 a month for the room, which was below market even by Callow Creek standards. She asked for 3 months in advance. She allowed Margaret to use the kitchen table in the evenings. She cooked dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays and left a plate in the refrigerator on the other nights without being asked. And she never once pressed Margaret for personal information about where she had come from or why she was there. She simply made space. And Margaret, who had spent most of her life in beautiful rooms that did not quite belong to her, found that a kitchen table next to a collection of ceramic roosters and a woman who asked nothing and gave much was the most genuinely restful place she had inhabited in years. The mill building came first. It was a substantial structure, built in the early 20th century, solid brick, 3 stories, with high ceilings and large industrial windows that the intervening decades had left mostly intact, though in considerable disrepair. It had sat empty for 11 years because the economics of restoring it had always outpaced the available local capital. And because the people with the capital to restore it had not until Margaret seen any reason to come to Callow Creek. Margaret hired local contractors. She made a deliberate choice in those early months to use only local labor wherever possible, not as a policy or a statement, but because she had done the math and understood that construction dollars recirculated through a local economy in ways that imported labor could not replicate, and because she wanted from the beginning for whatever she built in Callow Creek to be built by people who lived there. The project took 14 months. It was not without difficulty. There were budget overruns. There were structural surprises behind walls that the original estimates had not accounted for. There was a 3-week delay in the late winter when the heating system failed and work had to pause, while Margaret negotiated with a supplier she had never heard of in a city she had rarely visited. She handled all of it herself, with her own knowledge and her own resources and, when necessary, her own willingness to simply sit in the cold and think through a problem until she found the way through it. She was not used to this kind of problem solving. In her previous life, there had always been people for the difficult parts: attorneys, project managers, logistics specialists. Now there was just her, and she discovered, with a feeling that she would later struggle to describe adequately, that she was good at it, that the thinking that had always felt wasted in the management of her public-facing role was, when applied to actual problems with actual consequences, a powerful and satisfying thing. The Creek Commons, which was what Callow Creek eventually named the building because Margaret would not put her own name on it, opened in the early spring of the second year. It was a working commons in the truest sense of the phrase, shared commercial kitchen space that local food producers could rent by the hour, reducing the overhead that had prevented most of them from scaling past their kitchen tables. A flexible co-working area that the school district used on weekends for after-hours programs. Storage and processing space for the collective that several local farms had recently joined. Meeting rooms that the volunteer fire department, the county health board, the local business association, SONA and half a dozen other civic organizations used without charge, and a small coffee counter run from the opening day by a woman named Patsy Gillespie Jr., who was the daughter of the original Patsy and who had spent 6 years working at a chain coffee house in a larger city before returning to Callow Creek for reasons she described simply as, "I missed it." The Creek Commons did not transform Callow Creek overnight. Transformations that stick never happen overnight. What it did in its first year of operation was provide a space in which things that had been trying to grow found the light they needed. Small businesses that had been operating out of garages expanded. Collaborations that had been informal became structural. The school programs moved into the common spaces on weekends, and the arts curriculum, which had been surviving on the thinnest possible budget, suddenly had room to breathe. Margaret attended every opening event. She sat in the back row at every school performance held in the common space. She was not the host and she was not the sponsor, and she did not give speeches. She was a neighbor. She was, in the most literal and demanding sense of the word, present. But the Creek Commons was only the first layer of what Margaret was building. The layer beneath it, the one that would eventually become the most consequential thing she ever created, was taking shape in the evenings at Ruth Calloway's kitchen table. And it began, as the most important things always begin, with a question asked at a diner. It was a Thursday evening in the third year when the conversation happened. Margaret was at Patsy's. She ate there 3 times a week by that point, partly for the food, which was genuinely excellent, and partly because the diner was the place where the town talked to itself, the informal parliament of Callow Creek where the business of being neighbors got conducted over coffee and pie. She was sitting with a group that had begun to coalesce around the shared concern that was, by that point, the most pressing anxiety in Callow Creek, the school district's budget. It had been running a deficit for 12 consecutive years. Programs had been cut. Staff had not been replaced when they left. And now the whisper that had been circulating for 2 years had become something louder. Consolidation. The possibility that Callow Creek School would be merged with the district 20 miles away, and that children who were growing up in this town would have to be bused 40 minutes each way for their education. That the school, which was not just a building, but the organizing fact of the community, the thing around which the calendar of a small town turns and the identity of its children is formed, might simply cease to exist as a local institution. The group that evening included Donna Hatfield, who had known every family in Callow Creek for 2 decades, and who understood, with the clarity of someone who sees a community at its most unguarded, exactly what the school meant to it. There was Harold Pruitt, a retired social studies teacher who had spent 30 years at the Callow Creek Middle School and who had outlasted, with quiet stubbornness, every budget cut and administrative restructuring of the past 3 decades. And there were 3 farmers, Tom Weatherly, James Okafor, and a young woman named Sarah Bean, who had taken over her family's operation 2 years earlier, who had become regulars at the Creek Commons and who had developed, through the collective purchasing arrangement that Margaret had helped them structure, a tentative economic partnership that was the most encouraging thing Callow Creek's agricultural sector had seen in a generation. And there was Margaret, who had been listening to this conversation in various forms for almost a year, and who had spent a great deal of time at Ruth Calloway's kitchen table thinking about its implications. The group talked for a long time. They talked about funding and deficits and state formulas and the particular injustice of the way rural school districts were financed. a system that amplified the disadvantages of small communities rather than correcting for them. They talked about what had been tried and what had failed and what might still be possible. And then Harold Pruitt, who had a teacher's instinct for the productive question, said, well, what would it actually take? Not to save this particular budget cycle, but to make it so we're never having this conversation again. The table was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that a really good question creates. Not the silence of not knowing, but the silence of thinking seriously about something for the first time. And then Margaret, who had not spoken for the previous 40 minutes and who had been waiting, went with the patience of someone who has learned that the real problem never reveals itself until the room is ready to name it, said, "That's the right question. Can we spend some time with it? Not tonight, but properly. Can we meet the right group of people and spend some real time figuring out what the answer actually is?" They met 4 times over the following 6 weeks. Not always the same group. Margaret made a point of expanding the room each time, bringing in people whose perspectives the previous conversation had revealed were missing. The county commissioner, the superintendent of schools, a young real estate agent who had grown up in Callow Creek, left for a decade and come back when her first child was born, because she said she wanted her kid to grow up somewhere where people knew each other's names. An economist from a regional university who had been studying rural community finance for 15 years and who drove 2 hours each way to attend every meeting because, he said afterward, he had never been in a room where a community was asking the right questions with this much seriousness. What emerged from those 6 weeks of conversations was the beginning of what would become the Callow Creek Community Trust. Margaret had seen structures like it in the academic literature, community development financial institutions, place-based endowments, collective ownership models. But she had never seen one built from scratch in a community this size with this particular combination of assets and needs. It was in some ways the most intellectually challenging thing she had ever done. It was also the most alive she had felt while doing anything. The basic architecture was this: the trust would hold and manage a portfolio of local assets. The Commons building, a set of commercial properties that Margaret had quietly acquired over the preceding years, and agricultural land holding that the 3 farmers agreed to contribute in exchange for long-term lease arrangements that protected their operations while pooling the land's financial upside. The trust would invest the returns from these assets through a set of structures, some of which Margaret designed herself, drawing on everything she had absorbed growing up inside one of America's great business empires. In turn, and some of which she developed with the help of the university economist and a financial attorney she had found in the regional capital, who specialized in exactly this kind of work. The investment returns would fund 3 things: the school district's operating gap, a small business development fund that provided low-interest capital to Callow Creek entrepreneurs, and a reserve fund that was legally prohibited from being spent, and that would, over time, become the trust's permanent endowment. It took nearly 2 years to build the legal and financial structure from concept to operational reality. There were regulatory complications. There were moments when the right piece of the architecture refused to fit, and Margaret would spend 3 nights at Ruth Calloway's table working through alternatives until she found one that did. There were conversations with the school board that required more patience than Margaret had known she possessed, and conversations with county officials that required more diplomacy than she had thought herself capable of. But the work got done, the trust was filed, the assets were transferred. The first annual distribution to the school district was made in the late spring of the 5th year, enough to fully close the deficit, fund the music program that had been on the chopping block, and rehire 2 teachers who had been let go the previous year. Harold Pruitt, when he heard the number, put his head down on the conference table for approximately 10 seconds and did not speak. When he lifted it, his eyes were wet, and he looked at the woman who had spent 5 years building this structure from a kitchen table and a mill building and a question asked at a diner. And he said, "You know, when you first came here, I didn't trust you." And Margaret said, "I know." And Harold said, "I was wrong." And Margaret said, "You were being appropriately careful. That's different." By the 6th year, things were changing in Callow Creek in ways that were measurable and in ways that were not. Measurable. The school's music and arts programs were fully funded. The Business Development Fund had made 23 loans, of which 21 were current. The three farms whose land anchored the trust's real estate holding had all expanded operations. Tom Weatherly had hired 3 additional staff. James Okafor had purchased an adjacent parcel and converted it to organic production. And Sarah Bin had launched a direct-to-consumer operation that was reaching customers 3 states away through a distribution arrangement that Margaret had helped her negotiate. The Creek Commons was operating at 91% occupancy. The town's population, which had been declining by an average of 40 residents per year for the previous decade, had stabilized. In the 6th year, it grew by 11 people. 11 people. It does not sound like much. In a town of 2,300, fighting the demographic current that was pulling rural America apart, it was enormous. Not measurable, but real. The quality of the conversation in Callow Creek had changed. This is a strange thing to try to quantify. And yet the people who had been there before Margaret arrived, and were still there in the 6th and 7th year, were consistent in noting it. The conversations at town council meetings were different. Not easier, often harder, because the trust had brought new stakeholders into civic processes that had previously been dominated by the same small group of long-tenured residents. And new voices create friction before they create consensus. But more substantive, more future-facing, more concerned with what Callow Creek could become rather than simply what it was managing to survive. The school board met more often and with more energy. The business association had doubled its membership. There were 2 new businesses on Main Street, a hardware and feed supply run by a young man who had grown up in town and returned after college specifically because he heard the economic conditions had changed, and a small medical clinic staffed by a nurse practitioner who had been recruited by the Trust's Health Access Fund because Callow Creek had not had consistent primary care access for 7 years. The regional press began to write about Callow Creek, not dramatically. The stories were the kind that appear in the back sections of regional papers, in the economic development pages, in the rural affairs coverage that most readers skip. But they were accurate, and they named the trust, and they described its structure with enough specificity that people who understood community development finance could recognize what they were looking at. One article, published in an academic journal focused on rural economic policy, described the trust's financial architecture as displaying an unusually sophisticated integration of legacy asset management principles. The author was trying to describe a technical quality of the structure's design. What the author had actually done, unknowingly without intending to, was leave a fingerprint. The fingerprint was noticed by a man named Gabriel Hartwell. He was an estate attorney who had been managing the frozen portion of the Voss inheritance for 7 years. He was thorough, methodical, and, by his own admission, personally obsessed with the human question at the center of the case. Not the legal question of where the money was, but the human question of where Margaret was and why she had gone. He had read every article published about Callow Creek's revival. He had read the academic paper. And one afternoon, sitting at his desk with a cold cup of coffee and the journal article open on his screen, he read that phrase, legacy asset management principles. And he felt something shift, not knowledge, not certainty, a recognition. The specific fingerprint of someone who had grown up inside a family office structure and absorbed its methods so completely that they showed up even when the person was trying to do something entirely different. He drove to Callow Creek 3 days later. He parked on Main Street. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, "A lot of people have been looking for her for a long time. How do I know you're worth telling?" he told her. Donna called Margaret. Margaret called him back from a number he did not recognize. They arranged to meet. And on a Tuesday afternoon in the 7th year, Gabriel Hartwell sat across a diner table from a woman he had been thinking about for 7 years, and he said everything he had come to say about the inheritance, about the legal structure that had preserved her share, about the number, $2.3 billion. It had grown from its original 4 through 7 years of patient investment management by a team of attorneys and financial advisors who had, to their considerable credit, done exactly what they were supposed to do in her absence. Margaret listened. She did not react to the number in any visible way. She asked him one question. She said, What is the current estimated value of the Callow Creek Community Trust and its associated assets? Gabriel opened his notes. He had done this research before the meeting because he had known somehow that she would ask. He read her the figure, $4.8 billion. The thing she had built in 8 years is starting with a grilled cheese sandwich and a question about a mill building and a kitchen table next to a ceramic rooster collection was worth more than twice the inheritance she had walked away from. Gabriel Hartwell would later say it was the first time in 30 years of estate law that he had been genuinely unable to speak. Margaret looked at the number for a long time. Then she looked out the window at Main Street, at the Creek Commons, visible from Patsy's, its parking lot full on a Tuesday afternoon. At the hardware store with its handwritten sign. At the school, visible in the distance, where this was the thing that Margaret told Gabriel she thought about most. The music program was playing. You could hear it faintly through Patsy's walls. A student practicing something on a trumpet, not quite getting it right. Or trying again. The kind of sound that only exists in a school that is still open. The kind of sound that had nearly gone silent in Callow Creek 4 years earlier, and that now was just ordinary Tuesday afternoon noise. Background, unremarkable. The sound of a town continuing. Margaret accepted the inheritance. She accepted the $2.3 billion that had been waiting for her in legal suspension for 7 years. And then she did something with it that her brothers, her family's attorneys, and every financial journalist who later covered the story described in terms that range from visionary to incomprehensible, depending on their relationship to the concept of enough. She gave the bulk of it to the trust. Not all of it. She was precise about that, in the way of someone who has learned through years of actual work and the difference between a gesture and a structure. She retained enough to live the life she had built in Callow Creek with security and dignity for the rest of her days. She created a permanent endowment for Ruth Calloway, the woman who had given her a kitchen table and ceramic roosters and no questions when she needed all three. Sufficient to ensure that Ruth could live comfortably and that the house on the north side of town would be maintained and eventually contributed to a community land trust that would provide affordable housing for Callow Creek residents in perpetuity. She created funds for Donna Hatfield, for Harold Pruitt, for the 17 small business owners who had been the first to use the Creek Commons, for the volunteer fire department, for the school's arts endowment, and the remainder, the overwhelming majority of the Voss money, the money that bore her father's name and his father's Milltown hunger and 2 generations of American ambition, she used to endow the trust permanently, to make it, as she wrote in the legal document in language that her attorneys had to read 3 times before they understood what she was doing, irrevocable, self-sustaining, and permanent. William Voss called the decision a sabotage of the family legacy. He said this in a meeting with the family's attorneys and then denied having said it in a subsequent email. Charles flew to Callow Creek for the 2nd time. He spent 4 days. He had dinner with Margaret every night. He met Tom Weatherly and James Okafor and Sarah Bin. He sat in on a school board meeting. And he walked through the Creek Commons on a Saturday afternoon when it was full of activity. A farmer's market in one wing, a youth coding class in another, a meeting of the local historical society in a third, Patsy Jr.'s coffee counter doing brisk business in the center. And he stood in the middle of all of it for a long time, just taking it in. Then he found Margaret and he said, "You built something real." And Margaret said, "We built something real." The we was important to her. It was, in fact, the whole point. Catherine Voss came to Callow Creek in the early spring of the 8th year. She drove herself, which surprised everyone. She was 71 years old. She stayed at the bed and breakfast on the north side of town. She and Margaret had breakfast together every morning for 5 days. Whilst they did not resolve everything, 8 years and a funeral day departure and a family and legal suspension do not resolve into something simple just because 2 people sit across a breakfast table and try to be honest with each other. But they tried, with a honesty that their relationship had not previously permitted, because their relationship had previously been conducted within the architecture of a family that did not leave room for the kind of honesty that admission of hurt requires. They talked about Richard, about what he had wanted and what it had cost him and what it had cost them, about what it means to love someone in the language of what you have built, and whether that language is ever enough, about what Margaret had needed that no one in the family had known to provide, and whether knowing would have made it possible to provide it. On the last morning, Catherine walked with Margaret through the creek commons. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at everything carefully, in the way of someone making an assessment. And then she sat down at one of the tables in the shared workspace, in the center of the room, and she put her hands on the table, and she looked at her daughter, and she said, "Your father would have understood this. Eventually. I believe that. He would have argued with you for years about the method. He would have had opinions about the legal structure, and probably would have found 3 things he would have done differently. But underneath all of that, he would have understood it. Because what you did is what he did. You took nothing and you made something from it." And then put her hand over her mother's. And in that moment, she realized that she had been wrong. She had been wrong to think that her mother was the only one who could understand her. She had been wrong to think that she was the only one who could love her. She had been wrong to think that she was the only one who could be loved. She had been wrong to think that she was the only one who could be happy. She had been wrong to think that she was the only one who could be free. She had been wrong to think that she was the only one who could be herself. And in the Creek Commons, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, in a building that had once been an empty ruin, at the edge of a town that had been quietly losing its future, the two of them sat together in the thing that Margaret had built. Just the two of them. The light coming through the restored industrial windows. The sound of someone moving around in the commercial kitchen upstairs. Ordinary. Alive. Real. I want to be careful here, because stories like this one, stories about people who make extraordinary choices and build extraordinary things, carry a danger in the telling. The danger is the montage. The danger is the narrative of the person who walked away from everything and found everything better. It is seductive. It is also incomplete. And I made a promise at the beginning of this video that I would tell you the real story, not the comfortable version of it. So here's the real accounting. Margaret missed the last weeks of her father's life as his daughter. She was not at his bedside in the final months. She did not sit with him in the study with the drafting table and the scale models. She did not have the conversation she had not known how to have. The one in which she might have said to him, while he was still capable of receiving it, "I see what you built, and I know why you built it, and I love you, and I cannot live inside it." She did not have that conversation because she had concluded that it was not possible, that the architecture of their relationship and of the family and of the empire did not contain the structural support for that kind of honesty. She may have been right. She may have been wrong. She will never know. And that not knowing is something she carries. Not with guilt, exactly, but with the particular weight of an unanswered question that no longer has the possibility of an answer. The question of whether her father, in his final months, would have surprised her. The question of whether he might have understood. She missed 8 years of her mother aging, not in abstraction, but in the specific, irreplaceable accumulation of ordinary time. The Sunday phone calls, the holiday gatherings, the small crises and small triumphs that constitute the texture of a relationship between a mother and an adult daughter. Well, she missed the birthday when Catherine turned 70, which was a milestone that mattered to Catherine in ways that Margaret did not learn about until years later. She missed the diagnosis that Catherine received in the 3rd year, a minor cardiac event, fully recovered from, but the kind of thing that a daughter does not want to learn about in retrospect. She missed all the ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturday afternoons that are, in the end, what a relationship is actually made of. She spent 3 Christmases alone in Callow Creek before things changed enough for her to spend them differently. She spent 2 of those Christmases with Ruth Calloway and a ceramic rooster collection and a radio that got 2 stations and a level of solitude that was, in its own way, a form of practice. Practice at knowing herself, at being with herself, at understanding what she actually needed when she was not filling the space that other people's expectations had always occupied. That practice was valuable. It was also lonely. And loneliness, even chosen loneliness, even loneliness in the service of becoming something truer, has a cost that no accounting can fully capture. There is one more thing in the honest accounting, and it is the hardest to say. Margaret made the exit she made in the only way she believed she could make it. Completely all at once, on a day when the stakes were so high that no one could mistake it for anything other than what it was. She has never fully explained why she chose that particular day, though the people who know her best have their theories. And the most compelling theory is the simplest one. She chose the day her father was buried because it was the day on which the expected life would most clearly present itself as something she was choosing, consciously with full awareness of the cost. Not to live. She could not have done it on an ordinary Tuesday. The ordinary Tuesday would have looked like a breakdown, a crisis, an impulsive act. October 14th made it legible. It made it unmistakably a choice. But the cost of making it on that day, the cost to her mother, who had just buried her husband, the cost to her brothers, who were navigating their own grief while simultaneously managing a legal and financial crisis they had not expected, the cost to the people at the estate who had cared for Margaret since childhood, that cost was real and it was significant, and Margaret has said in the few conversations in which she has addressed it directly that she does not minimize it. She made the least harmful version of the exit she needed to make, and it still caused harm. That is something she lives with. She does not perform guilt about it in a way that would allow you to absolve her. She simply carries it as an honest person carries the honest accounting of their choices without putting it down and without letting it stop her from continuing to build what she came to Callow Creek to build. This is, in the end, what separates Margaret Voss from the simpler version of this story that writes itself in the mind when you first hear the headline. She is not a saint, or she is not a cautionary tale. She is a person who saw something clearly and acted on what she saw at enormous personal cost and built something extraordinary from the space that was left. She did it imperfectly. She did it honestly. And the things she built, the trust, the commons, the school with the music program, audible through the walls of Patsy's diner on a Tuesday afternoon, is still there, growing, compounding, irrevocable. The word she chose for the legal document, the word she has chosen for her life. I have been thinking about what I want to say in this final section for a long time, because this story could be told as many different stories. It could be told as a story about wealth and its corruptions. It could be told as a story about a difficult family and the damage that high expectations do to the people who cannot meet them. It could be told as a story about a woman who was braver than most. All of those are true as far as they go. But I think the story that is most worth telling, the one that I believe your 35-year-old self and your 55-year-old self and every version of yourself in between can actually use, is something more specific. It is a story about the difference between the life that is performed and the life that is lived. And it is a story about the fact that the distance between those two things is never as far as we have trained ourselves to believe it is. We have a very specific story we tell in America about what success looks like. You've heard it. You've told pieces of it yourself. It looks like the name on the building. It looks like the account balance in the statement you try not to look at too carefully. It looks like the title and the neighborhood and the lifestyle and the children who go to the right schools and the vacations that photograph well. Richard Voss lived that story to its absolute fullest. He was, by every measure that story recognizes, a success of the highest order. And his daughter looked at the entirety of what he had built, and she said essentially, "I see you. I understand why you built this. I believe you lived it with everything you had, and I need to go write a different one, not a better one. Not a judgment on yours, a different one that is mine." What she built in Callow Creek was worth more, not just financially, though it was worth more financially as well. And there is something in that fact that feels like the universe making a point, though I try not to put too much weight on the universe making points. It was worth more in the sense that mattered to Margaret. It was worth something to people who needed it. It compounded not just in value but in consequence. Every dollar that went through the trust structure touched more than one life. Every business the fund supported employed people and fed families and kept someone from having to leave the place they called home. Every year that the school stayed open was another year in which a child in Callow Creek grew up knowing that the place they were from was worth investing in, that it was not a place you had to flee to have a future. That is the thing that Margaret built. Not just a trust, not just a building, the belief in a community that had been losing faith in itself that it was worth staying for. Before we go, I want to ask you something, because I believe that the comments section of a video like this one can be something more than a place where people argue with strangers. I believe it can be a place where people are honest with each other about what a story like this one actually touches in them. So here is my question, and I genuinely want you to think about it before you answer. What is the performance you have been delivering that is not quite your own? It does not have to be $4 billion. It does not have to be a funeral day departure and 8 years in a town nobody has heard of. It can be small. It usually is small. The career you chose because it was what your family expected. The city you stayed in because leaving felt impossible. The version of yourself you performed for the people who knew you before you changed. The dream you keep in the locked top drawer of your interior life. The one you look at late at night and then close back up before morning. What would you do with the space if you stopped performing it? What grows in the space where the expected life used to be? Leave your answer in the comments. I mean that. Not as a formality, not as an engagement prompt. I read the comments on this channel. I have read them for years. And on the videos that ask the hardest questions, the comments are where the real story lives. This is a hard question. I think you have a real answer. I want to hear it. And if this story stayed with you, if you felt it land somewhere in you that the easy stories don't reach, then I have one more thing to say. Next, I'm going to bring you the story of a man who spent 22 years building a technology company worth $340 billion. The morning after he signed the sale documents, the morning after the deal closed, after all the lawyers shook hands and all the wires cleared and his net worth changed forever, he called his personal banker. He gave instructions that his attorneys spent 18 months trying to understand, and his own children spent 3 years trying to forgive him for. And what he did with every dollar of that $340 billion, every single dollar, nothing kept, was the most deliberately, specifically human thing I have ever researched for this channel. Subscribe so you are here when that story drops. You will not want to have missed it. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. It means more than you know.